Jonathan Harrington's polished shoes scuffed against the pavement, their once pristine leather dulled by months of wear and neglect. He trudged through the quiet streets of a nameless town, each step heavier than the last, the burden of his disgrace pressing down on him like a physical weight. The man who once commanded boardrooms with authority now avoided eye contact with passersby, ashamed of the hollow reflection he'd become. His fall from grace had been both sudden and brutal. One moment, he was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar investment firm, celebrated for his brilliance. The next, his name was splashed across tabloids, accused of reckless mismanagement and financial fraud. Though he had been framed by a partner he trusted, it didn't matter. The public needed a villain, and Jonathan fit the role too well. The lawsuits, the humiliation, and the bankruptcy stripped him of everything: his wealth, his home, and his reputation. As he shuffled along the dimly lit street, he clutched a weathered suitcase in one hand, its contents reduced to the remnants of a life he could barely recognize. A silk tie he no longer wore, a leather-bound journal filled with ideas that never saw the light of day, and a photograph of his parents taken long before success had consumed him. The suitcase was lighter than it had been months ago, yet it seemed to grow heavier with each passing mile. The town itself felt like a strange limbo, its quiet charm mocking his internal chaos. Colorful awnings hung over small shops, their windows glowing warmly in the twilight. A bakery displayed fresh pastries. A bookstore featured a sign promising an evening reading event. But none of this comforted Jonathan. Instead, it deepened the ache inside him, reminding him of what he had lost, not just wealth, but a sense of belonging. His stomach growled, breaking the silence of his thoughts. Hunger gnawed at him, a persistent reminder of how far he had fallen. The days of tailored meals and fine dining were long gone. Now, every crumb was a struggle, every meal a gamble. He glanced around, searching for a bench, a place to rest, but the streets seemed oddly empty, as though even the town rejected his presence. He finally stopped near a flower shop, the scent of fresh blooms wafting through the air. The vibrant display of sunflowers, roses, and daisies spilled out onto the sidewalk, their cheerful colors a stark contrast to the gray that had settled over his life. He leaned against the building, his legs trembling from exhaustion. A dull ache spread through his chest, not just physical fatigue, but the slow realization that he had no one left to turn to. Memories of his former life surfaced unbidden. The grand office with its glass walls overlooking the city, the staff who once scrambled to meet his every demand, the gala evenings where he was the center of attention. It all felt like a cruel dream now, a life that belonged to someone else. He let out a bitter laugh, the sound dry and hollow. What would those same people think if they saw him now? Would they pity him or gloat? Jonathan's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, the rough pavement scraping against his hands. For a moment, he considered staying there, letting the world pass him by. What was the point of fighting anymore? He had no money, no home, no hope. Even his pride, the one thing he had clung to, felt like a distant memory. Just as the darkness threatened to consume him completely, the scent of lavender and eucalyptus wafted through the air. He looked up, his blurred vision catching the silhouette of a woman standing nearby. Her face was shadowed, but her posture exuded calm strength. Before he could process the moment, her voice broke through the haze. "Are you all right?" she asked, her tone gentle yet firm, cutting through his despair like a lifeline. Jonathan hesitated, unsure how to respond. Was he all right? The answer was painfully obvious, but something in her voice held him there, suspended between the crushing weight of his reality and the faint glimmer of an unfamiliar warmth. As the twilight deepened, her presence became the only anchor keeping him from sinking entirely into the abyss. The woman stepped closer, her features soft and illuminated by the faint glow of the shop's window. Her voice was calm, like the hum of a lullaby, but it carried a firmness that demanded attention. "You look like you need something to eat," she said, crouching down to meet Jonathan at eye level. He flinched at her proximity and used to kindness without strings attached. "I'm fine," he muttered, though the deep rumble of his stomach betrayed him. He tried to straighten himself, to project the faintest shred of dignity, but his trembling hands and sunken cheeks made it impossible. The woman tilted her head slightly, unconvinced. "Wait here," she said with a nod, her tone leaving no room for protest. Before he could argue, she disappeared into the shop, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender that clung to her apron. Jonathan sat still, unsure whether to stay or leave. He wasn't accustomed to being the recipient of charity. It felt foreign, humiliating even, yet there was something disarming about her presence. For the first time in months, someone had looked at him without scorn or suspicion. It unsettled him. A moment later, she returned, carrying a small plate with a sandwich and a cup of tea. "It's not much," she said, handing them to him, "but it'll fill your stomach." She knelt beside him, brushing her hands on her apron. Jonathan stared at the plate, his pride warring with his hunger. He wanted to refuse, to cling to the last vestiges of self-respect he had left, but the sight of the food overwhelmed his resistance. "Thank you," he murmured, the words scraping out of his throat like gravel. He reached for the sandwich, his hands trembling as he took a bite. The taste of fresh bread and soft cheese hit his tongue, bringing an unexpected wave of emotion. He hadn't realized how starved he was, not just for food, but for a reminder of what humanity felt like. She didn't pry as he ate, instead turning her gaze toward the shop's flower display. "My name's Clara," she said, as if speaking to the blooms rather than him. "I own this place. Been running it for about 10 years now." There was no expectation in her tone, no demand for his story in return. It was simply an offering, an introduction with no strings attached. Jonathan swallowed, his voice hoarse. "Jonathan," he replied. It felt strange to say his name aloud, as though it belonged to someone else now. He didn't offer more, and Clara didn't press. When he finished eating, Clara stood and wiped her hands on her apron again. "You're welcome to rest for a while," she said. "I've got a small shed out back. It's not much, but it's dry, and there's a cot." She hesitated, her eyes searching his face. "You look like you could use a place to catch your breath." Jonathan's instinct was to refuse. Pride, or perhaps shame, made him recoil at the thought of relying on someone else. But the weariness in his bones and the ache in his chest left him with little choice. I don't want to be a burden," he said quietly, his voice laced with guilt. Clara smiled, a gentle curve of her lips that carried no judgment. "You won't be," she said simply. "Everyone needs a little help now, and then, come on." She led him around the side of the shop to a small wooden shed. The space was modest, with just enough room for a cot, a chair, and a shelf stacked with gardening tools. A single lantern hung from a hook, casting a warm glow. Clara stepped inside and quickly tidied the cot, shaking out the blanket before turning back to him. "It's not much," she said again, her tone apologetic. "But it's safe, and it's yours for as long as you need." Jonathan nodded, the words of thanks catching in his throat. He stepped inside, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over him. As Clara moved to leave, she paused at the door, her hand resting lightly on the frame. "Good night, Jonathan," she said softly, her voice carrying the kindness he hadn't realized he craved. The door closed, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Jonathan sank onto the cot, staring at the lantern's flickering light. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he didn't feel completely invisible. Clara's simple acts of compassion had cracked the walls he had built around himself. Lying back, he let out a long breath, unsure of what tomorrow would bring, but strangely comforted by the thought that he might not face it alone. The first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the shed's wooden walls, casting soft streaks of gold across Jonathan's face. He stirred, momentarily disoriented, his hand brushing the rough fabric of the blanket Clara had laid out for him. For a brief second, he forgot where he was, the quiet calm of the shed, so different from the chaos and noise of his recent life. Then reality came rushing back. The scandal, the losses, the stranger's eyes filled with contempt. Yet, here he was, in a place he hadn't earned, under the care of a woman who owed him nothing. The shed smelled of earth and flowers, a strange yet soothing blend of soil and blooms. On the shelves, gardening tools stood neatly in rows, alongside small pots of fertilizer and jars of seeds labeled in Clara's neat handwriting. There was an undeniable charm to the simplicity of the space. Jonathan sat up slowly, the stiffness in his back a reminder of how long it had been since he'd slept in a real bed. Through the shed's small window, he could see Clara in the garden, her figure framed by rows of colorful flowers. She moved with practiced ease, her hands working the soil while her face held an expression of quiet focus. The early morning sun seemed to light her from within, casting a halo over her as she tended to her plants. It was a stark contrast to Jonathan's own movements, which felt heavy, labored, as though he carried the weight of his failures in every step. Feeling awkward and unsure, he stepped outside. The cool morning air hit him, carrying the faint scent of roses and eucalyptus. Clara glanced up from her work and smiled. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm but unobtrusive, as if she sensed he needed space to find his footing. "How'd you sleep?" "Well enough," Jonathan replied, his voice rough from disuse. It wasn't the full truth. He'd spent much of the night staring at the lantern's soft glow, his thoughts tangled, but he didn't want to appear ungrateful. Clara nodded, her hands busy as she patted soil around the base of a newly planted sapling. "I usually have coffee brewing by now," she said, brushing dirt from her gloves, "but mornings get away from me when I'm out here. You're welcome to come inside if you'd like a cup." Jonathan hesitated, the idea of entering her home making him feel like an intruder. He looked down at his clothes, creased and worn, and wondered if she would regret inviting him in. But Clara didn't seem to notice his discomfort. She removed her gloves and dusted off her apron, motioning toward the back door of the shop. "Come on, it's no trouble." Inside, the shop was a reflection of Clara herself. Warm, inviting, and unpretentious. The counters were lined with vases filled with fresh-cut flowers, their colors brightening the room. On a wooden table sat a teapot and two mismatched cups, one chipped but still usable. Clara poured the coffee with the same care she'd shown the flowers outside, handed him a cup as if it were a ritual they'd shared for years. Jonathan sat awkwardly at the table, unsure where to place his hands. Clara, sensing his unease, spoke in a way that didn't demand a response. She talked about the morning deliveries she needed to make and how the hydrangeas in her garden had bloomed early this year. Her voice filled the silence without overwhelming it, like a melody that didn't need lyrics to convey its meaning. As the coffee's warmth spread through him, Jonathan felt his tension begin to ease. There was no judgment in Clara's presence, no expectation for him to explain himself or prove his worth. It was a foreign feeling, but one he found strangely comforting. After breakfast, Clara stood and tied her gloves back on. "I'll be in the garden most of the day," she said. "Feel free to rest or explore the town if you'd like. The shed's yours for as long as you need it." Jonathan stared at her, stunned by her generosity. He wanted to ask her why she was doing this, for a man she didn't know, for someone with nothing to offer in return, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded, his gratitude unspoken but evident in his eyes. Clara left him alone, and for a while, Jonathan remained at the table, the steam from his coffee rising in gentle spirals. He glanced around the shop, noticing the details he'd missed before. The photographs of Clara with an older man, likely her late husband, and the small notes of encouragement written on sticky notes stuck to the walls. "You're stronger than you think," one read. He wondered if Clara wrote them for herself or for the customers who passed through her doors. Standing up, Jonathan made his way back to the shed, the warmth of Clara's kindness lingering in his chest. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost forever, the faint, fragile beginnings of hope. Jonathan stood in the shed, staring at the rows of tools and gardening supplies that surrounded him. His hands hovered over the small rake Clara had handed him earlier, her casual instructions echoing in his mind. "If you're up for it, the flower beds need some weeding. No rush and no pressure." The words had been simple, but the gesture carried a weight he couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't just an invitation to help, it was an opportunity to belong. He walked to the flower beds with hesitant steps, the rake feeling foreign in his grasp. The soil was soft beneath his feet, the garden stretching before him in neat, colorful rows. Clara's touch was evident everywhere, every plant carefully spaced, every bloom vibrant and healthy. The garden was an extension of her, resilient, beautiful, and full of life. Jonathan crouched down and began pulling at the weeds, his movements slow and unsure, as though afraid he might damage the delicate plants around them. Clara worked a few feet away, pruning roses with quiet efficiency. She didn't speak, giving him space to settle into the task. Occasionally, she hummed a soft tune, the sound blending with the rustling leaves and distant chirping of birds. Jonathan found the silence strangely soothing, a stark contrast to the noise that had filled his life before. Ringing phones, shouting investors, the endless clatter of his once busy world. At first, the work felt tedious. His fingers, unused to manual labor, ached as he tugged stubborn weeds from the earth. Sweat beaded on his brow, and he cursed under his breath when a particularly thorny stem pricked his skin. But as the minutes turned into hours, he found a rhythm. Each weed he pulled left a patch of soil bare and ready for growth, a small but tangible improvement. It was a satisfaction he hadn't expected, a sense of progress he hadn't felt in months. Clara glanced over at him, her eyes crinkling with approval. "Not bad for someone who claims he's never gardened," she teased lightly. "You got a good touch." Jonathan huffed a small laugh, brushing dirt from his hands. "I don't think Wall Street prepared me for this," he replied, his tone carrying the faintest hint of humor. It was the first time he'd joked in what felt like a lifetime, and it surprised even him. Clara smiled, but didn't press the moment, returning to her work. Her restraint, her ability to let silence fill the space without demanding answers or explanations, was something Jonathan appreciated more than he could express. She treated him as though he were just another person. Not a failure, not a disgrace, but someone capable of contributing, no matter how small. By midday, the sun was high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the garden. Jonathan stood and stretched, his back protesting the unfamiliar strain. Clara handed him a glass of lemonade, condensation dripping down its sides. "You've earned it," she said, her tone playful but sincere. He sipped the drink, the tangy sweetness refreshing against the heat. As he looked around, he realized how much they had accomplished together. The flower beds were clearer, the plants standing taller without the encroaching weeds. It wasn't a grand transformation, but it was progress. And progress, no matter how small, felt like a victory. Clara sat beside him on the low stone wall that bordered the garden, wiping her hands on her apron. "This place was my husband's dream," she said, her voice soft and reflective. "When we first bought the shop, I didn't know a thing about flowers. But he loved them, said they were a reminder that even in the hardest times, something beautiful could bloom." Jonathan listened, her words settling in his chest like a gentle weight. He thought about his own life, the wreckage he had left behind. Once, he believed that success was the only measure of worth, that anything less than perfection was failure. But sitting here, surrounded by Clara's garden, he wondered if he'd been chasing the wrong kind of growth all along. Clara nudged him lightly with her elbow. "Don't overthink it," she said, as though reading his thoughts. "Gardening's simple. You give things a little care, a little time, and they figure out the rest." Jonathan looked at her, the sincerity in her words disarming. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could start over. Not as the man he used to be, but as someone new. He set the empty glass down and picked up the rake again, his movements more certain this time. If nothing else, he could make the garden a little better. And for now, that was enough. The soft glow of the lantern flickered as Jonathan sat on the cot in the shed, the quiet night wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. Outside, the faint chirping of crickets punctuated the silence, but inside his mind, a storm raged. His hands rested on his knees, trembling slightly as memories clawed their way to the surface. Memories he'd tried so hard to bury. He hadn't spoken much about his fall from grace, even to himself. It was easier to focus on the hunger in his belly or the ache in his feet than to confront the shame that burned in his chest. But something about Clara's presence, her gentle persistence, her unwavering kindness, chipped away at the walls he had built around himself. That evening, after a simple dinner Clara had prepared, they sat in her small kitchen. She had poured him a cup of tea, her hands moving with practiced ease, and sat across from him with her own. The room smelled faintly of chamomile and the flowers that filled her shop, a soothing balm to his restless mind. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Clara didn't press him, didn't pry. She sipped her tea, her gaze steady and patient. It was the absence of pressure that finally made him speak. "I used to run a business," he began, his voice low and halting. He stared into the dark liquid in his cup, as though the answers he sought might be hidden there. Clara set her cup down, her eyes soft but attentive. "What kind of business?" she asked, her tone light, as if she were asking about the weather. "Investments," Jonathan replied, his words clipped. He hesitated, his throat tightening. "I was successful. At least, that's what everyone thought. Big office, big house, lots of people who acted like they cared." Clara nodded but didn't interrupt. Her silence encouraged him to continue. And slowly, the dam holding back his story began to break. "It all fell apart," he said, the words spilling out now. "A partner I trusted stabbed me in the back. He made the decisions, but I was the face of the company. When it crashed, everyone blamed me." His hands clenched around the cup, the ceramic cool against his skin. "The media tore me apart. Lawsuits, hearings, people I thought were friends vanished overnight. My family." His voice broke, and he took a shaky breath. "Even they turned their backs on me. I lost everything." The room fell silent again, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. Jonathan felt exposed, raw, as though he had laid his very soul bare. He braced himself for judgment, for pity, but Clara's expression didn't change. "That must have been unbearable," she said softly, her voice carrying no hint of condescension. "Losing so much, and so suddenly." Jonathan blinked, surprised. He had expected her to lecture him, to tell him he should have been more careful or less trusting. Instead, her words carried only understanding. "It was," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think I'd survive it." Clara leaned back slightly, her gaze never wavering. "But you did," she said simply. "You're here." The simplicity of her statement struck him. He had survived, though he often wondered why. Sitting across from Clara, he began to understand. It wasn't about surviving for survival's sake. It was about what came after, about finding a way to rebuild. Clara reached across the table and placed her hand lightly on his. "We all break, Jonathan," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Sometimes it feels like we'll never put the pieces back together. But cracks aren't the end. They're just the start of something new." Her words lingered, resonating in a way Jonathan hadn't expected. He had spent so much time mourning what he had lost, he had never considered the possibility of building something different. Perhaps not as grand or as polished, but something real. For the first time in months, he didn't feel completely alone. Clara's quiet strength, her ability to see him not as a failure, but as a man trying to find his way, gave him a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him want to try. As they finished their tea, Jonathan felt a small shift within himself, a crack in the armor he had worn for so long. It was terrifying, but it also felt like the first step towards something new. When he returned to the shed that night, he didn't feel the same crushing weight of despair. Instead, he felt the faintest stirrings of possibility, like a seed buried deep in the soil, waiting for its chance to bloom. The soft chime of the bell above the shop door echoed as Clara closed it for the night. She sighed, brushing her hands over her apron and glancing at the cash register. The day's sales had been modest, better than some days, worse than others. Jonathan noticed the way her shoulders drooped as she locked the door, her movements slower than usual. For someone who carried herself with such warmth and strength, the strain of her burdens was beginning to show. Jonathan sat at the small table in the corner of the shop, where he had started helping Clara organize receipts and inventory. He had offered to help when he noticed the stacks of paperwork piling up, and though she hesitated, she eventually agreed. Tonight, however, she seemed preoccupied, her thoughts elsewhere as she absently rearranged a vase of lilies. "Long day?" he asked gently, breaking the silence. Clara looked up, her lips curving into a tired smile. "Long week," she admitted, pulling out a chair across from him. She sat down and rested her hands on the table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. "Some weeks are harder than others, but that's just how it goes." Jonathan set down the ledger he'd been studying. "You don't have to sugarcoat it," he said, his tone soft but direct. "I can see it's more than just a long week." Clara hesitated, her fingers stilling on the table. For a moment, it looked as though she might deflect, but then she sighed and leaned back in her chair. "You're right," she said. "It's not just this week. It's been hard for a while now." She glanced around the shop, her eyes lingering on the rows of flowers and plants that lined the walls. "This place was my husband's dream," she said, her voice tinged with both pride and sadness. "He loved flowers, said they were a reminder of all the good things in life, even when times were tough. When he passed, keeping the shop going felt like the only way to hold on to him." Jonathan listened quietly, sensing the depth of her pain in every word. Clara continued, her gaze distant. "But running it alone, it's not easy. Bills pile up faster than sales come in. The roof needs repairs, and the delivery truck barely runs anymore. Some days, I wonder if I'm just fighting a losing battle." Her voice caught on the last sentence, and she paused, swallowing hard. "But then I think about him," she said, her tone resolute. "How much this shop meant to him. And I can't give up. Not yet." Jonathan felt a pang in his chest. Clara's determination, her refusal to let go of the shop despite the odds stacked against her, reminded him of the grit he once had. But unlike him, she didn't have wealth or influence to fall back on. She was fighting with nothing but her willpower and the memory of the man she loved. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jonathan asked, his voice filled with quiet concern. "You've been helping me, but I didn't realize you were dealing with all of this." Clara shrugged, a small, weary smile playing on her lips. "Everyone's dealing with something, Jonathan. Besides, I didn't help you because I expected anything in return. That's not how it works." Her words humbled him, her selflessness a stark contrast to the transactional relationships he'd known in his old life. For Clara, kindness wasn't a strategy or a currency. It was simply who she was. "I want to help," he said after a pause. The words surprised even him, but they felt right. "You've done so much for me already. Let me do something for you." Clara's eyes softened, but she shook her head. "You've been helping just by being here," she said. "The company has been nice. I haven't had much of that lately." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice steady. "I mean, really help, Clara. You don't have to do this alone." For a long moment, Clara said nothing, her expression thoughtful. Then, finally, she nodded, a glimmer of relief in her eyes. "All right," she said quietly. "If you're sure." Jonathan nodded, his resolve firm. Helping Clara felt like more than just repayment for her kindness. It felt like a chance to rediscover a part of himself he thought he'd lost. As they sat together in the quiet of the shop, surrounded by the vibrant blooms that symbolized resilience and growth, Jonathan made a silent promise. He wouldn't let Clara fight this battle alone. Not if he could help it. Jonathan sat at the small, worn desk Clara had cleared for him in the corner of her shop. His brow furrowed as he scribbled notes on a piece of paper, surrounded by receipts, order forms, and catalogs of flowers. Clara stood nearby, arranging a bouquet of daisies and baby's breath, occasionally glancing at him with curiosity. The intensity with which he worked reminded her of a time when she and her late husband had dreamed big for the shop. "What are you working on so hard over there?" she finally asked, setting the bouquet on the counter. Jonathan looked up, the faintest spark of energy lighting his expression. "Ideas," he said simply. "This place has so much potential, Clara. We just need to think outside the box a little." Clara chuckled, leaning against the counter. "I'm not exactly a businesswoman, Jonathan. I barely have time to keep up with what's already on my plate." "That's the thing," Jonathan said, sitting back and running a hand through his hair. "You shouldn't have to do everything alone. And with a few changes, you won't have to. Look at this." He slid a paper across the table toward her, his neat handwriting outlining a list of suggestions. Clara picked it up, scanning the ideas. Workshops? Delivery services? Seasonal events? She raised an eyebrow, a skeptical smile on her lips. Jonathan, I appreciate the effort, but this all sounds a bit ambitious. It's not as complicated as it sounds, he said quickly, leaning forward. You already do most of this in some form. You've been giving me tips on arranging flowers, haven't you? That's basically a workshop. We just need to make it official, set up a class, advertise it. People will pay for that experience. Clara set the paper down, her smile softening. And what about the delivery service? I can barely keep the truck running as it is. Jonathan tapped his pen against the desk, thinking, what if we partnered with a local driver? Someone with a reliable vehicle who could handle the deliveries for a small fee. It's an expense, but it would free up your time and attract more customers. Clara crossed her arms, her gaze thoughtful. Any events? You really think people around here want to come to a flower shop for an event? Jonathan nodded. Absolutely. Think about seasonal themes, spring planting parties, autumn wreath making, winter floral arrangements for the holidays. You've got a community here that clearly cares about this place. We just need to give them a reason to show up. Clara sighed, the weight of her doubts still lingering. It all sounds great in theory, Jonathan, but what if it doesn't work? What if I pour what little I have left into these ideas and it still isn't enough? Her question hung in the air, heavy and real. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. I get it, he said. Taking risks is terrifying, especially when you've already given so much. But I've spent a lifetime chasing guarantees, and I can tell you this. There are none. All we can do is try. Clara stared at him, her eyes searching his face. There was no bravado in his voice, no empty promises. Just sincerity and a quiet determination that mirrored her own. She glanced back at the paper, the list of ideas suddenly feeling less overwhelming and more like possibilities. Okay, she said finally, a small smile tugging at her lips. Let's start small. We'll try one of your ideas, maybe the workshops, and see how it goes. Jonathan grinned, a rare sight that lit up his tired features. Deal, he said, already jotting down notes. I'll handle the logistics. You just focus on being your brilliant self. Clara laughed, the sound light and genuine. Brilliant, huh? You must be desperate if you're buttering me up like that. Jonathan shrugged, his smile lingering. Just calling it like I see it. As the evening stretched on, the shop filled with the quiet hum of their collaboration. Clara offered insights into the community's needs, while Jonathan brought structure and strategy to her ideas. Together, they mapped out the first steps toward revitalizing the shop. For the first time in years, Clara felt a spark of hope, not just for her business, but for the possibility of sharing the load with someone who genuinely cared. And for Jonathan, each idea he sketched on the page felt like another brick in the foundation of his own redemption. They were a team now, and while neither of them knew what the future held, they were ready to face it together. The first workshop was set for Saturday morning, and by the time the sun began to rise, Clara and Jonathan were already bustling around the shop. Clara adjusted the rows of chairs she'd borrowed from a neighbor, making sure they were perfectly spaced. Jonathan worked on a last-minute adjustment to the sign outside the shop, its bold letters advertising. Flower arranging for beginners. A hands-on workshop. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and glanced at Jonathan, who was leaning over the sign with a critical eye. You think anyone will actually show up? She asked, her voice light, but tinged with nerves. Jonathan turned to her, brushing chalk dust off his hands. I'd bet on it, he said, his confidence steady. We passed out flyers, put up posters, and talked to everyone who came into the shop this week. Trust me, they'll come. Clara gave him a tentative smile, but couldn't shake the knot of doubt in her stomach. She had poured her heart into this shop for years, and the thought of trying something new and possibly failing was enough to make her chest tighten. Still, Jonathan's optimism was contagious, and she clung to it like a lifeline. As the clock approached 10, the first participants began to arrive. A mother and her teenage daughter walked in, their eyes lighting up at the colorful flowers arranged neatly on the tables. Next came an elderly man with a twinkle in his eye, followed by a young couple holding hands. By 10:30, Nearly every chair was filled, and Clara had to bring in a few extra from the back. Jonathan watched the room fill, his heart swelling with quiet pride. The sight of Clara standing at the front of the room, her hands clasped nervously in front of her apron, was a reminder of why he had pushed so hard for this. She had a way of drawing people in, of making them feel at ease, and it was that same quality that had pulled him from the depths of his despair. "Good morning, everyone," Clara began, her voice a little shaky but warm. "Thank you for coming to our very first workshop. Today, we'll be learning how to create a simple but beautiful bouquet using seasonal flowers." Jonathan watched as she moved through the room, demonstrating techniques with an ease that seemed to grow as the workshop went on. The participants leaned in, their laughter and chatter filling the space with an energy the shop hadn't seen in years. Clara's nervousness melted away as she encouraged a young girl struggling to tie a ribbon and teased the elderly man about his choice of flowers. In the corner, Jonathan worked quietly, refilling pitchers of water and tidying up the supplies. It wasn't his moment, and he didn't need it to be. Watching Clara shine was enough. She had given him a second chance, and now he was more than happy to stand in the background, making sure her moment went off without a hitch. When the workshop ended, participants lingered, chatting with Clara and taking photos of their finished bouquets. Several asked about future events, their enthusiasm clear. Clara beamed, the kind of smile that lit up her entire face. Jonathan caught her eye from across the room, and she gave him a small, knowing nod. They had done it. After the last guest left, Clara leaned against the counter, letting out a long sigh. "That was incredible," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "I can't believe how many people came, and they actually enjoyed it." Jonathan grinned, leaning on the opposite side of the counter. "Told you they would. You got a gift, Clara. People feel it the moment they walk in here." She shook her head, laughing softly. "You're giving me too much credit. I couldn't have done this without you. You pushed me to try." Jonathan's expression softened. "You didn't need much of a push," he said. "You've had this in you all along. I just helped you see it." The two of them stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the shop still buzzing with the energy left behind by the morning's success. Outside, the sun shone brightly, casting warm light through the windows and onto the vibrant blooms that filled the room. Clara glanced at the calendar on the wall. "So what's next?" she asked, her tone playful but genuine. Jonathan smiled, already pulling out a notepad. "I've got a few ideas." As they began brainstorming, the knot of doubt in Clara's chest unraveled completely. For the first time in a long while, she felt not just hope, but excitement. The shop wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And she wasn't doing it alone. Together, she and Jonathan were building something new, something full of possibility. It was more than she had dared to dream, and she couldn't wait to see where it would take them next. The vibrant energy that had filled Clara's flower shop after the successful workshop lingered for days. New customers trickled in, curious about upcoming events, and the regulars seemed more engaged than ever. Jonathan found himself immersed in planning, working side by side with Clara to breathe new life into her business. For the first time in what felt like years, things were looking up. But as is often the case with newfound hope, a shadow soon appeared to threaten it. It started with an official-looking envelope slipped under the shop's door one morning. Clara found it as she was unlocking, the crisp white paper standing out against the worn wooden floor. She hesitated before picking it up, her stomach twisting with unease. Jonathan noticed her hesitation and walked over, wiping his hands on a towel. "What's that?" he asked, nodding toward the envelope in her hand. Clara shook her head. "I don't know. It looks important." Her voice wavered slightly as she opened it. Her eyes scanned the contents, and her face fell. "It's from a developer," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan frowned, taking the letter from her hands. His sharp eyes quickly absorbed the message. A wealthy real estate developer was offering to buy Clara's property for what seemed, at first glance, like a generous sum. But the language in the letter was clear. If she didn't accept the offer, the developer would pursue other means to acquire the land. "They want to turn the block into a commercial complex," Clara said, her voice trembling. "They're giving me 30 days to make a decision." Jonathan's jaw tightened as he read through the fine print. "This isn't just an offer," he said, his voice low and controlled. "It's a threat. They're trying to push you out." Clara sank onto one of the stools by the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the letter. "This shop, it's everything I have," she murmured. "It's all I have left of my husband. I can't lose it, Jonathan. I can't." Jonathan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his expression steely. "You're not going to lose it," he said firmly. "Not if I have anything to say about it." But even as he said the words, Jonathan's mind raced. He knew how these developers worked, ruthless and relentless, with deep pockets and a team of lawyers ready to crush anyone in their way. The shop's recent successes had given Clara a fighting chance, but this was a different kind of battle, one that required more than workshops and community events. It required strategy, leverage, and the will to stand up to a giant. That afternoon, Clara and Jonathan sat together in the back room, surrounded by stacks of papers and documents. Jonathan reviewed everything he could: property deeds, financial records, and the developer's letter, searching for any loophole or advantage. Clara watched him work, her anxiety evident in the way she twisted a loose thread on her apron. "Do you really think we can fight them?" she asked, her voice small. "People like this, they don't back down." Jonathan looked up, his expression resolute. "They don't back down because they think they can scare people into submission," he said. "But you're not just anyone, Clara. You've built something real here, something this community cares about. That gives us power." Clara's eyes softened, but doubt lingered in her voice. "I don't know if I have the strength for this," she admitted. "It feels like every time I start to make progress, something like this happens." Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze steady. "You do have the strength," he said. "You've been fighting for this shop for years. This is just another challenge, and you're not facing it alone. We'll find a way." Over the next few days, Jonathan and Clara worked tirelessly to prepare for the fight ahead. Jonathan reached out to local businesses and community members, rallying support for the shop. Clara spoke to her loyal customers, sharing her fears and hopes in equal measure. Together, they drafted letters, organized meetings, and began planning a public campaign to raise awareness about the developers' plans. Despite the mounting pressure, there were moments of lightness. Late one evening, as they sorted through documents, Clara caught Jonathan staring at an old photograph of her and her late husband. "He'd have liked you," she said softly, her voice carrying both warmth and sadness. "He always believed in standing up for what mattered." Jonathan glanced at the photograph, his expression thoughtful. "I'll take that as high praise," he said, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I hope I can live up to it." As the deadline loomed closer, the fight became more intense. The developer sent another letter, this one more aggressive, warning of legal action if Clara refused to sell. But instead of backing down, Clara and Jonathan doubled their efforts. For Jonathan, it wasn't just about saving the shop. It was about proving to himself that he still had the ability to fight for something meaningful. For Clara, it was about holding onto the legacy she and her husband had built together. By the end of the week, the shop was filled with signs of their determination. Posters advertising a community rally, stacks of petitions waiting for signatures, and a growing list of supporters willing to stand by their side. The looming threat of the developer still cast a shadow, but within that shadow, a spark of hope glimmered, bright, fragile, and worth fighting for. The community rally was set for Saturday afternoon, and by the time the clock struck 2, Clara's flower shop was surrounded by people. Customers, neighbors, and even strangers drawn by word of mouth gathered with signs, flowers, and a shared determination. The once quiet street buzzed with energy, a stark contrast to the subdued atmosphere that had lingered over Clara's shop just weeks ago. Clara stood near the shop's entrance, her hands trembling as she gripped a small bouquet of daisies. The flowers had always been her favorite, simple yet resilient, thriving in conditions where others might wilt. Jonathan stood beside her, a reassuring presence, his suit, borrowed from a local thrift store, neatly pressed. His eyes swept over the crowd, a flicker of pride visible on his face. "You did this," Clara said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you." Jonathan shook his head, his tone soft but firm. "We did this," he corrected. "And it's not over yet." But look at them, Clara. They're here because of you. As Clara stepped forward to address the crowd, Jonathan watched her with admiration. She spoke from the heart, her voice steady despite her nerves. She talked about her husband's dream, about the importance of small businesses in the community, and about how flowers had the power to bring people together, even in the hardest times. Her words were met with cheers, applause, and a renewed sense of purpose among those gathered. The rally spilled over into the street, where local musicians played and tables were set up to collect signatures for a petition to preserve the shop. Clara moved through the crowd, accepting hugs and words of encouragement from her neighbors. Jonathan worked in the background, coordinating volunteers and speaking with a reporter from the local newspaper who had shown up to cover the event. The turning point came when the developer himself arrived. A tall, imposing man in a tailored suit. He stepped out of his car and surveyed the scene with thinly veiled annoyance. The crowd grew quiet as he approached Clara, his expression a mix of frustration and disdain. "Ms. Harper," he began, his tone clipped. "This is quite the display, but it changes nothing. My offer stands, and I assure you, the legal process will favor me in the end." Before Clara could respond, Jonathan stepped forward, his posture calm but commanding. "Actually," he said, holding up a folder of documents, "you might want to reconsider that." The developer frowned, glancing at the folder. "And what's this?" "Evidence," Jonathan said simply. "Your plans to rezone this area require community approval, and as of this morning, we've gathered over 1,000 signatures opposing your development. You'll also find documentation of environmental concerns related to the project, concerns that could tie this up in court for years." The developer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing as he flipped through the papers. The silence stretched, and the tension in the air was palpable. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he closed the folder and handed it back to Jonathan. "Fine," he said curtly. "You win this time, but don't expect me to give up so easily." The crowd erupted into cheers as the developer walked away, his threats ringing hollow in the face of their united front. Clara turned to Jonathan, her eyes shining with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You really did it?" Jonathan smiled, the weight he had carried for so long finally lifting. "No," he said softly. "We did it." In the days that followed, the shop became a beacon of hope and resilience for the community. Clara and Jonathan worked tirelessly to build on their success, introducing new events, expanding their delivery service, and even starting a community garden in honor of Clara's late husband. The shop thrived not just as a business, but as a symbol of what could be achieved through determination and solidarity. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara and Jonathan stood in the garden, admiring the rows of blooms that stretched before them. The air was warm, carrying the scent of roses and lavender. Clara reached down and plucked a single daisy, handing it to Jonathan with a smile. "This is for you," she said, "for everything you've done, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Jonathan took the daisy, his heart full. "You gave me a second chance, Clara," he said. "You didn't just save this shop. You saved me." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their journey settling between them like a quiet promise. The garden, bathed in golden light, seemed to bloom brighter than ever, a testament to their shared resilience and the beauty of new beginnings. As the stars began to appear, Clara slipped her hand into Jonathan's, and together they walked back to the shop, ready to face whatever came next. In that moment, it wasn't about what they had lost or what they had overcome. It was about the simple, undeniable truth that hope, like a flower, could thrive even in the harshest of conditions. And together, they had proven that the most beautiful things often bloom when you least expect them. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.